Coming up next on C-SPAN 2, a conference focusing on the changes in the Middle East since the war in the Persian Gulf. The conference was sponsored by the Middle East Institute, a nonprofit educational corporation. At the opening of the conference today, participants heard a keynote address from Christopher Hitchens, a columnist with The Nation. We now bring you his remarks entitled "The Middle East and American Democracy."
Welcome to the 45th Annual Conference of the Middle East Institute. As people are getting seated, I'd like first of all to inform you about some of the changes in the program, which I understand happen every year. I'll go through all of the program so that you'll be aware prior to the beginning of each panel what's going to happen. Unfortunately, I regret to say Hanan Ashrawi is not able to be with us today. She's back in Ramallah. Radwan Abu Ayyash will replace her on that panel to present the Palestinian perspective. Can't hear? Who's in control? I'll repeat, Hanan Ashrawi is unable to be with us today, and her place will be taken by Radwan Abu Ayyash, a journalist from the West Bank, who will present the Palestinian perspective on the first panel. Dan Kurtzer is also unable to participate in this panel, and instead we'll have Dr. William Quant, who will act as moderator and who will briefly address the American role on that issue. Panel 2 will proceed without any change. In Panel 3, we have one change. We were unable to arrange for a participant to come from Tehran, and instead we've called on Shireen Hunter to address the topic of Iran and the Gulf. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Panel 4 participation remains unchanged. On Panel 5 tomorrow morning, the second panel tomorrow, Hisham Melhem will be the moderator. Both Edward Said, our original panelist, and Sari Nusseibeh, who's listed in the program, in the printed program, were prevented from participating by unforeseen medical problems. Therefore, we'll have, as listed, Abdelbaki Hermasi, who will focus on the Maghreb, and we will have Asad Abu Khalil, who will look at the Near Eastern area, and Mohammed Haki will give an overview with special attention to Egypt. Finally, the student session Saturday afternoon will not be chaired by Bill Quant, who has a travel commitment out of town, but rather by Helena Cobbin, same time, same place. There's no change in the banquet speaker as listed. We will be welcoming former Senator George McGovern, who will address American policy and the settlements issue. Some tickets for the banquet are still available at the registration desk for those wishing to join us for this event. There is a special discount for the banquet for faculty and students. Thank you for noting these changes. For every session, including the keynote address, which will begin in a minute, there will be a question and answer period. There are 3x5 cards around the room on the chairs. Please write out your questions. They'll be collected by staff of the Middle East Institute during the presentations and given to the moderator, who will then pick and choose amongst them and present them to the speakers. As I said, that applies to the first talk also. Our keynote speaker to open the conference this morning is Christopher Hitchens, who writes for The Nation, Harper's, and New York Newsday. He's currently conducting a study of Kurdistan for the National Geographic. He's the author of many books, including Hostages to History, Cyprus from the Ottomans to Kissinger, and co-authored with Edward Said a book entitled Blaming the Victims. He's also the author of a study of the Anglo-American special relationship entitled Blood, Class, and Nostalgia. Another of his books deals with the so-called Elgin marbles, the statuary removed from the Parthenon on the Acropolis early in the last century. Mr. Hitchens was educated at Oxford University's Balliol College. His topic today is the Middle East and American democracy. Mr. Hitchens.
Ambassador Keeley, ladies and gentlemen, I chose this topic with care after having, in the course of an argument about the lack of partisan politics in Washington not long ago, been told that if I wanted a multi-party system, I should go back to Russia. And I felt then, as I feel now, that there is arguably a false distinction in what we describe as the domestic and the international agenda. And I'm going to try and repair that breach in my remarks this morning. Possibly my most conservative colleague in the journalistic profession is the BBC Middle East correspondent John Simpson. Some of you I know have met him and followed his work. He was the man who put in the most time in Baghdad during the Gulf War, resisting the general flight from that city of the international press. And he's just published a book in England called From the House of War, which you won't have seen yet. So I'm in a position to share with you, as people sometimes like to say, two extracts that particularly caught my eye. The first describes an episode in May 1987, and I'll read briefly an extract from John Simpson's book. By the beginning of 1987, if not before, American satellite and radar intelligence was being handed to Iraq in considerable quantities, and the United States had become an active, if secret, partner in Iraq's battle against Iran. American intelligence officers plotted the movements of Iranian troops and planes and passed the information on to Iraq. According to one officer who served with them, 2 American warships, the USS Stark and her sister ship Kuntz, had the task of radioing the coordinates of targets which American intelligence officers themselves recommended to the Iraqis and guiding them on to the attack. On the 17th of May 1987, 2 Exocet missiles from an Iraqi Air Force Mirage homed in accidentally on the radio beam from the Stark, which was directing the pilot to his target. Following the beam down, they struck the Stark amidships, killing 37 American crewmen and injuring dozens of others. The incident was not allowed to interfere with the strategic decision to help Iraq in its war with Iran. Saddam Hussein wrote President Reagan a fulsome letter of apology and cooperated in full with an American board of inquiry. The Reagan administration did not even ask Iraq for compensation, since it understood perfectly well that the incident had been an unfortunate technical accident. Here's John Simpson reporting on the situation in the Middle East and American policy in 1987. Now here's him reporting on it in 1991. A large shelter has been struck in Baghdad. It has turned out not to be a hardened command and control center, but to be packed with frightened civilians. And here's the eyewitness description of what was found within. Inside the building, it was still hot. This is the following day. Inside the building, it was still hot, and the rescue workers were still finding bodies. Some of the bodies were complete, others had been fused together by the heat and the blast, and lay crooked and absurd on the stretchers as the rescuers ran out with them, eager to finish the terrible job and get away. Sometimes there would be nothing but a great mass of flesh. Downstairs, the surface of the water was 1 inch thick in melted human fat. Now, between 1987 and 1991, in other words, American policy shifted from helping Saddam Hussein to guiding exocet missiles onto Iranian targets to turning his civilian population into soap. Meanwhile, it was discovered in 1986, 1987 that another faction of American foreign and military policy was also covertly engaged on the opposite side of that war in ensuring that the Iranians had the weaponry with which to deflect any Iraqi attack and attempting to pay for those weapons with other human warm bodies in the shape of American hostages. Now, these three policies could be described as contradictory, but that wouldn't be my point about them. My point about them was that however these changes in policy, or these variations in policies, were connected, it was not considered right that any of us in this room should know of them, that these policies were decided in secret, that they were conducted with secret diplomacy, using the methods of covert arms trading, secret hostage dealing, and other more traditional, as well as less orthodox methods. And we, therefore, can deny, if we will, responsibility for the exocets, for the soap, for the hostages, for the arms trading, for the whole thing, because it wasn't considered proper or necessary that we be informed or consulted about it. But that is the connection between consideration of the policy and consideration of the idea of a democratic republic that imagines itself to be sovereign over such policies. The fact that the United States could secretly be on both sides of a war with two sharply distinct countries and cultures, which its citizens, our citizens, were at the same time led to believe were all but at war with the United States, is bizarre. And it turned out that everybody knew more about it than Congress did. The Saudi Arabians turned out to be the financiers of the Nicaragua policy. The Israelis turned out to be the armorers and the directors of the Iranian policy. These are the policies of the United States. Men who had blown up the United States embassy in Kuwait and were being held in prison there were told on tape to hang on until Oliver North could get round to brokering their release. And not even the Secretary of State knew of these channels of policy. Indeed, so widespread was the ignorance of policy that the man responsible for it, the President of the United States, was almost able to sound convincing when claiming to know nothing about it himself. And when all this double dealing broke down, we had to render hundreds of Iraqis into fat, melted fat, and then have a celebration of our united national sense of purpose. Now, I think that this leaves me plenty of scope for a critique of the relationship between American democracy and American foreign policy. And I'll mention some of the more salient headings before I take your questions, and I will try and remain conscious of the time. Now, any country, of course, and people can make a mistake about Saddam Hussein. The United States has made, I think, 3 major mistakes about him in the recent past. And the Palestinians, for example, made one only last year. But there is a difference. The Palestinians are not allowed to recover from the mistake in the same way that we can. They are told they have no margin for error. On the contrary, I doubt there's anyone in this room who hasn't heard it said, and perhaps hasn't disputed it when it is said, that the Palestinians' lack of circumspection about Saddam Hussein and the Gulf War now disqualifies them from being considered for self-determination. That, in some sense, they are not allowed to make the mistakes that the United States has made, that miscalculations on their part may lead to a complete denial of their right to statehood and self-government. The Palestinian people, alas for us, cannot be so readily dismissed. They are a responsibility of the United States. They live, it mustn't be forgotten, to all intents and purposes under a Pax Americana. The conditions of their lives, the conditions of the occupation, the conditions of their economy, the conditions of their exile, internal and external, are conditions that are set by departments in this city, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, the State Department, and also by the legislative branch, which votes the relevant titles, deeds, grants, and endowments that allow this Pax Americana to continue. In other words, it's not a responsibility that can be lightly shrugged off, especially since the Palestinian people some time ago served notice that taking one consideration with another, they would rather die or at least risk death than continue to endure the conditions that we calmly have determined for them. This, in other words, is a rejection at all points, democratically decided, by a whole people, educated, intelligent, cultured, at the center of the Middle East, of a policy which it therefore seems to me we might have to reconsider. I think a start could be made in reconsideration if we cleaned up a little the terms of speech which we employ when we discuss it. I'll say briefly what I mean. No service, it seems to me, is done to democracy by referring to the Israelis and the Palestinians, any more than it used to be when the vulgarization was the Israelis and the Arabs. The success of the Intifada at least taught newscasters and some politicians to refer to the Palestinians as a people in their own right rather than Israel versus the Arabs, but there still needs to be a little more distinction made, I think, if we're to think democratically and to deal democratically with others. For an example, Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota this year attended a conference sponsored by Tikkun magazine of the Israeli peace movement and the American peace movement in Jerusalem. In doing so, he became the first American senator ever to go to Israel in order to meet with the peace movement alone. It is considered enough for most senators to go to Israel to meet only the government and to consider that they have met the Israelis. We do no service to those in Israel who may even potentially be a majority, who are in favor of a consideration of land for peace, who worry about the militarization of their society and the corruptions of the occupation, not to treat with them as if they were a democracy too, and not to adjust our own democratic sights to that consideration. And it seems to me a scandal that the world's greatest deliberative body has so far fielded only one senator once on the other side of this point. Very simple point that I'm making. In other words, it isn't enough just to say of Israel that we support it because it's the only democracy in the Middle East. If it is not its democratic aspect and its democratic method and its democratic tradition that we are in fact supporting, if it turns out that indeed we are supporting the militarizing and the fanatical and the orthodox and the uniform aspects that in turn threaten that democratic state. In other words, here again, I think there's enormous room for self-criticism. Now, it's been argued by some people that the original sin of American policy in the region was its attempt to enter the region as, if you like, the successor to British imperialism. In other words, to enter the region not as an honest broker or a disinterested superpower, but as the successor to a discredited colonialism. And it's been argued that the hinge moment was the overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran in 1953 with the collusion of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Anglo-American Oil Corporation. I think that would be too pessimistic and too uniform a reproach to make, though it must be said that that period also inaugurated a time where too much policy was franchised to covert operators, to arms dealers, to other people who in our own culture do not necessarily play any more democratic a role than they do overseas. However, we are this month commemorating the anniversary of a rather more serious attempt at American even-handedness in the region. In that month, in 1956, as Keith Kyle's excellent new book on the Suez Crisis points out, the British and French and Israeli attack on Egypt was coordinated in such a way as to make a bet that an America in the throes of an election would not dare rein in the Israelis. And it's a pleasure to read Keith Kyle and his account of how this cynical maneuver turned out to underestimate American democracy. It's rather salutary, in fact, to read of the rage of President Eisenhower and of his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, at the very idea that such a calculation could be made, that American democracy attachment to the rule of law, and even-handedness was so likely to be set aside. And the insistence on the resolutions of the United Nations, on the immediate withdrawal of from illegally occupied territory, and the very swift listing of what consequences would follow if this program was not carried out. Now, I think we could contrast that with today, where President Bush, faced with the illegal policy of settlement and occupation, has indeed made an issue of the matter of timing and of the matter of finance, but has not so far availed himself either of an appeal to the American electorate to consider its own responsibility in this, or of the large and growing sheaf of United Nations resolutions, which, if implemented, would put axiomatically an end to the settlement problem in and of themselves. It is remarkable, given that the United States was prepared to go to war only a few months ago for a United Nations resolution, that this recourse to resolutions of the UN hasn't been made by either the President or his Secretary of State in the present crisis. Now, the other night on ABC Nightline, to be exact, the night before last, tapes were played in which Israeli officials warned American officials that they could, if they chose, release documents and evidence that would show that a major press conference made in this city on a foreign policy matter by the US Attorney General was a tissue of lies. I don't know how many of you saw it, but there was Amiram Nir on tape saying to Oliver North, "How have you let the Attorney General do this? Don't you know that we can make your Attorney General look a fool any time we like? Don't you know we have the goods on him?" Excuse me, I get excited when I recall this. Don't you know, in other words, that you are a hostage to our policy? There are some who say that it's conceivable that this is a revenge by the Israelis for a policy determined by the State Department that they currently find embarrassing. If that was true, or that it could even be said, and that this could be materialized, in other words, is a tremendous warning to us of the blowback consequences of undemocratic foreign policy. It shouldn't be the case that security policemen and national security figures in other countries can, as it were, hold American democracy hostage to policies that should have been determined by Congress and that have not been. And here, if you like, if I can use an outmoded phrase, is the dialectic between one kind of democracy and another, between, as it were, ours and theirs. I think we have, and I still want to leave time for your questions. We have 3 test cases on this that confront us now. The first is the Palestinians, where I think I've sketched the reasons why we have no right to disown or abandon them, why they have to be considered an American responsibility. Before us is a very simple question. Should they be allowed to submit their own delegation, to have a delegation of their own choice and selection at a peace conference sponsored by the United States? Excuse me, I remember hearing Abba Eban many years ago saying that he could foresee a day when the Israelis could pick their own delegation to a peace conference, and he could also foresee a day when they might have to forswear picking the Palestinian one. He was joking, but we can't be joking. As a matter of fact, it still remains to be said by either the President or the Secretary of State that the Palestinians have simply that elementary right. I think we can do no less than demand for them what we would ask for ourselves, the right to pick our own delegates. The second example of people I think we have no right to abandon are the people of Kurdistan. These are people to whom promises have been made of self-determination, of the right to live in peace, and also of the right to take part in discussions about the democratization of the wider societies in which they live, the societies of Iran, Syria, obviously and very notably Iraq, but also Turkey. Now, I think I'm not alone in having the impression that that promise, which has been made by more than one administration, is considered very slightly embarrassing at the moment. There doesn't seem to be all that much enthusiasm in Washington just now for the demands of Kurdish democracy and self-determination. I think, again, we have the responsibility of not letting that subject be stricken from the agenda. Finally, we have the case of the other electoral parliamentary Western-style democracy in the Middle East, namely the Republic of Cyprus. It's been much too long now. It's been nearly 17 years since that island was forcibly partitioned in open defiance of the expressed will of the majority of its inhabitants, subjected to foreign occupation, subjected to the bringing in of colonists and settlers in order to alter the demography of the island, and in other ways maimed and amputated both as a republic and as a democracy, setting an extremely bad precedent for local self-aggrandizement in the region. And again, this is a responsibility that Americans cannot duck. Both the major participant outside powers in this quarrel, Greece and Turkey, are in the first place NATO allies, and in the second place are recipients of enormous quantities of American military and economic aid. It is not, therefore, for the United States to wash its hands of the consequences of the policies followed by people who can properly be described as its proxies. In all these cases, I stress, there is the availability of principles already adumbrated, already reiterated, and already implicit in our own democracy. We are being asked, in other words, to do no more than live up to what we have already demanded for ourselves and undertaken through United Nations resolutions on Palestine, on Kurdistan, and on Cyprus for others. I began with the suggestion that there was an original sin in 1953 in Iran, and I'll wind down by alluding to the suggestion that there was another sin in 1980, that in 1980 an American election was held hostage to an overseas policy, that the exploitation of American hostages allowed a political campaign, a partisan campaign in this country, in concert with the agents of at least two other foreign powers, Iran and Israel, to intervene, actually to negate, to distort the results of an American presidential election. This must still be regarded, Congress is sitting on it now, I say sitting on it in the sense of convening on it, I hope, an inquiry, and which the members of the panels were nominated this week. And what looks to be a very devastating book is about to fall from the press, written by a man known to some of you, Captain Gary Sick, then of the National Security Council. If it were to turn out to be true that the revenge for an intervention in Iranian internal affairs in 1953 was an Iranian intervention in American internal affairs in 1980, I could, I think, claim to have encapsulated the point I wanted to make. Benjamin Franklin, when asked by a lady as he left the famous meeting in Philadelphia, "What have you given us?" said, "Well, madam, a republic, if you can keep it. Those of us who want to revere and maintain republican and democratic virtues have to be on our guard against threats to them, both from domestic and foreign enemies. I think we would do well to make common cause with those who in their own countries call for democracy and become, in that way, the more staunch guarantor of our own." Thank you.
I think we can do this here. Do we have any more questions from the monitors? The first question, thank you, is why did the U.S. and its allies leave Saddam Hussein in power?
I think the answer to that is they thought they might need him again. I don't mean to sound cynical about it, but it wouldn't be the first time that the calculation had been made. In principle, you're familiar with the old remark made actually by Roosevelt about Somoza, well, he may be a bastard, but he may be our bastard. In other words, that consideration has been known to influence policy before. In general, I think in particular it was very noticeable that, and is noticeable in the written record right up until the last few closing staves of April Glaspie's long transcript, that Saddam Hussein was considered as at least a candidate in the role of an American favorite in the rather chaotic situation that still obtains for American interests in the aftermath of the collapse of the Shah of Iran. There was also, to be even more specific, very strong Saudi pressure against any breakup, or sometimes called Lebanization, of Iraq, in particular any breakup that might open the possibility of a of a Shia protectorate or Iranian protectorate so near the Saudi border. And I think when the Saudis thought about it, they thought they wanted a Sunni Muslim military dictatorship in Baghdad, and though they would rather have had one that didn't include Saddam, they'd rather have had Saddam's dictatorship than not have one at all. And I think that was the kind of pragmatism for which the ground in Washington had been very well manured.
Second question, why did the American and European press fail to provide a plausible critique of U.S. policies and military actions during the Gulf War?
Cowardice and conformism. I went on the press plane to Desert Shield, not a Desert Storm, for one longish trip with the president, and realized then and there that all the technical ingredients and most of the moral ingredients for the creation of a megaphone press had already been put in place before the first shot was fired. Nothing that happened afterwards did anything to disappoint me in that respect. I was surprised, however, by the extent to which so many of my colleagues were prepared, as it were, to volunteer to do things before the administration asked them to do so. I think the mass evacuation of the press from Baghdad on the eve of the bombing remains the single greatest disgrace and the greatest breach of faith with readers and viewers that the press has yet been guilty of.
Do you think we're hostage to Israel on forcing Soviet Jews to go to Israel? Should we reopen and double our quotas to solve this problem?
I'm not sure who's hostage to who in that case. I mean, there's a multiple collusion involved here. First, it's true that with pressure from Israel's friends in this country, it's become harder for a Soviet Jew wishing to choose his country or her country of residence to choose the United States. It's a little-known fact that the United States imposes a numerus clausus, a quota, on Soviet Jewish immigration. Second, it's been negotiated between the Israeli government and the Soviet government, though not very many people are aware of it, that any Soviet Jew leaving the Soviet Union automatically surrenders his or her citizenship, something that an American or German or French or English Jew doesn't have to do if they want to go and try making the Aliyah. In other words, that's a further narrowing of the options. And third, that third-party countries, transit countries, for this traffic in people who are frightened enough to want to leave the Soviet Union and who are uncertain but who the government of Israel wants to direct to live in Israel. Transit countries are frowned upon by the Israelis if they don't sign an agreement saying that they will pass arriving Soviet Jews on only to an Israeli destination. And in fact, there have been quarrels between the Israeli government and the government of both Finland and Czechoslovakia who say, no, anyone who comes to our airport is entitled to pick their onward destination. That doesn't sit well with the Israeli Ministry of Absorption. It is, I think, really deplorable that a state policy in which our own administration is complicit should exploit one oppressed and endangered people, the Soviet Jews, in order further to increase the difficulties and the deprivations of another oppressed and exploited people, the Palestinian Arabs of the occupied territories. I think that's a redoubled cause for shame.
The Kurds share with their cousins in Iran an Iranian race, culture, tradition, and history. Doesn't this give Iran, the motherland, if you will, a say in Kurdistan's future? In your remarks, you seem to delegate this responsibility to the West instead, rather than to Iran. Why so?
Well, I think the same could be said by a partisan of the idea that Iraq or Turkey was a Kurdish motherland, because obviously there are overlaps between Kurdish culture and Turkish culture and Iraqi Arab Mesopotamian culture too. So that could be said of any of the countries where Kurdish populations live. I laid a burden on the Western powers because undertakings have been made to the Kurds in the past, sometimes quite solemn ones, sometimes rather cynical ones, but all tending to the view that there should be a Western guarantee of the right of Kurdish self-determination, whether that self-determination takes the form of regional autonomy negotiated with each successive government, or a wider dispensation of self-government. However, any literate Kurd, literate, that's to say, in any of those languages or cultures, is entitled to say to the West that he or she has been promised something freely. This was not a promise extorted by the Kurds from us, and therefore that it's a debt of honor, an obligation.
The Greek majority in Cyprus has treated the Turkish minority as the Israelis have been treating the Palestinians. This has been substantiated by concrete evidence. Moreover, the 1960 treaty between Britain, Greece, and Turkey holds the parties responsible to assure the human rights of all parties. Please comment.
Well, I can't accept the premise of the question. Cyprus is not occupied by a Greek army, it's occupied by a Turkish army. The northern third of the island has been completely cleared of its original inhabitants. A mass expulsion, a transfer, as some Israeli politicians would call it, something that's only threatened by the Israelis on the West Bank, has actually been quite ruthlessly carried out in Cyprus, so that a population that was settled there in stability for many thousands of years and can show a continuous record of occupation of the in the benign sense and civilization, has simply been decanted and deported, and the cultural traces of its presence forcibly erased. If there is therefore any analogy at all with the treatment of the Palestinians, it would tend in the opposite direction to the one indicated by the questioner.
Why did the American media, specifically the print media, support the administration in discrediting the peace movement?
I'm not sure I can really accept the premise of that question either. It seemed to me that at least before the war began, if we're talking about the same war, that such a peace movement as there was got reasonable play on the air. My problem actually was much more with the peace movement than with the press. The peace movement in this country, in my opinion, acted in a very narrow, isolationist and almost chauvinistic way. It said that a war was more or less all right with it as long as it could be guaranteed in advance that American casualties would be kept low or minimal. Thought that was a dishonorably narrow way of approaching the question. But it would explain why there wasn't really any protest when that was done, because that guarantee could be given as long as the war was fought only in Iraq and fought only from the air, where there was no possibility of retaliation. But unfortunately, that also meant that when large numbers of Iraqis were turned into soap, as I just described to you, and many others, as we've since found out, were bulldozed and buried alive and in other ways done away with, and people don't even want to think about the body count really at all because they're afraid of what they might find out, there was no protest. Rather, there was, I think, a deplorable sense of relief that that these were the way casualties were being registered. Indeed, I've heard quite intelligent people say only what a relief it was that so few people were killed during the war, when what they mean is so few Americans.
Please comment on the fact that so many people in the Arab world and the Third World in general, including many intelligent and well-educated individuals, are convinced that Saddam Hussein is a CIA agent.
I think instinct tells them that he would be flattered to be asked to be a CIA agent. But I don't think there's any evidence that he has ever been more than briefly considered for that role. I think that it is certainly the case that for a long period during the Gulf War, he and the United States were, in a sense, fighting in the same trench. This certainly made a convincing impression on the Iranians. And I think possibly what may be meant by the question is that here's a man, as it were, capable of large and protean changes. We may not have seen the end of them.
That's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Christopher Hitchens.
We'll continue our coverage of this conference on changes in the Middle East after a short break. If you'd like more information on this speech by Nation columnist Christopher Hitchens, you can write to the Middle East Institute. The address is 1761 N Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20036.